How's it going, everyone? In today's video, we're going to be looking at another one on how to create like minimal house stabs, but this one's going to take a bit of a different approach to the more in-depth one I did, which basically covered everything, as there's not really like one set way to do it. So how I outlined it in that video was kind of like drawing the chords, finding patches within synths, and then adding effects. But if we replace the finding the patches in synths with using like simplers and pad sounds, we can get something quite nice as well. And then we can draw like single line melodies. So there's kind of multiple ways really you can get these sounds, and I find that using pads and playing around with simplers is quite a nice way to do it as well. If you don't want to go down that route of drawing the chords and finding different sound patches and stuff, you can do either or. But essentially that's what this tutorial is going to be. So we're going to be looking at how to create those minimal house chords using pads. So to begin with, I'll just show the example I had. So these are the chords I've programmed with synths. So we've got like a Rhodes one, which is like that kind of pattern that moves along, which is kind of what I explained in the tutorial. Not just the one chords, like the individual chords that bounce off one another. And you've got these ones. So like you can continue down this route of like using synth patches and stuff, but something I like to do is basically go into the simpler and drop pad samples, because like pad samples are not single voice. If you're using like chords, you've got like multi-voice sounds. So if I was to drop a note that's just playing A in, it would play back quite well. But if I transpose a chord, it's got this nice like modulating effect, which is similar to what I described. It's like the staple of like rave stabs. If I think of the tutorial, it was the Ketma and Ewan McVicker rave stabs from scratch. I'll link all these as I mention them for anyone who's interested. But if I just go to this and I play, so that's an A. Obviously I've added effects and all that stuff, but I'll take that off. So I'm playing C, and then if I just move up the keyboard, so you see that it's quite nice because it's transposing a chord as opposed to a single note, which is kind of why this technique works so well, which is because you get a certain characteristic with your sound. So just to start off, I've got this channel down here. So you could skip this step if you already had a bunch of pad samples, but just for a quick recap, I've got this pad MIDI layer with certain effects. I've got all the patches, and it's just very basic. I think we're working in A flat minor, and I think I have possibly the 7th note above. Just a more interesting chord. Doesn't matter. Take that chord. Once you've found the patch, and you can do the processing before you sample it, which will have quite a nice effect when you go to resample it. But you can also do it after, like it doesn't really matter with these things. And then what I've done is I've resampled it from that layer, And then underneath I have dragged the sample, this one, and I'll take the processing off for now, and I'll solo it. That's what I get. I've bumped the volume up, and here is kind of where you have so much potential. Like, I could go on for hours talking about all the different things you can do from this point onwards, but I'll just kind of provide some interesting points that I might do, and you can obviously get creative. So this is the sample. And then, because it's in, first thing I would do is I'd make sure it's pitched correctly to the key of the track, in which case this one definitely was, because I drew in the A flat minor chord. And then within the sample view, you can go classic mode, which will play back as long as you're holding a note. And you've got one shot, which will play like even if I'm not holding a note. So you'd maybe change it to gate, which is kind of similar to the above. I think there is a difference, but I couldn't tell you what it is, and I don't think it really matters. And then you can start playing around with like the frequency within here. But you'll hear, basically, you're taking these full pad samples and you're shortening them. So you not only get like the modular effect when you're transposing, but you get the kind of quite nice sounds that when you strip them back to like the stabby, short stabby notes sound quite good still, even without processing. And I'd probably have to bump the gain up, but I could play around with the frequency within the simpler sampler. Transposition, fade, because sometimes when you don't have a fade on, like within classic mode, you can go in and you can loop it. So what I can do is I can alter the start and end points. And I can add a bit of attack, so it's kind of like fading in more gradually. Because sometimes with these samples it might end and you might hear like a click, like a dropout. So if you wanted to just have one sound, you could basically do this. And add a fade. So you can lip it, or you can literally just keep it as it is and rely on when you place the notes and like when they're off. And then with some other example, and then here I've just kind of got creative, like the effects chain changes throughout, but if I just run through it, I've basically got like different variations of this kind of effects chain where it's EQ, cleaning up, bit of compression to kind of even out the volume, a wacky auto filter of some kind where the LFO is on to add a bit of movement. Sometimes I'll have it with a bandpass instead. To create that kind of like wow effect. But in this case I don't. You can create so much variation. Another wacky LFO, and then modulation, which is king, reverbs, delays, maybe LFOs if you want to move them. There's like so much potential here, like I was saying, so I'm not going to like go into the effects chains in too much detail, but the effects chains do make a massive difference, so definitely get creative with them. But I can basically I found this effect. I'm using Ableton 11 now, and I quite like this effect of it's called the XY pad. It basically allows you to map multiple things and move along the grid. So I've mapped these, and I can still change them as well with this effect, which is nice. So it basically moves on different axes. So if I move along here, the frequency goes up, and if I move along up here, the resonance goes up. So there's all sorts of crazy like Max for Live effects you can use. And then if I just show other examples, like which are pretty much the same. This one, I've modulated the start points. So like with this one here, the example wasn't great, so I'll stay on this. The good thing about these pad loops, and it's something I kind of showed in the, not just specific to pad loops with like synth loops. So there's a technique which I showed in like manipulating synth loops tutorial, where you can slice and it will play back at different points in the sample, which is good with loops that are constantly changing. So with one shots, you probably won't hear as much of a difference when you do it like slicing wise. But when you take a synth loop and you put like a sequencer in front of it, it will move along, and you'll get those kind of like dubby synth minimal loops you sometimes hear. But with this, unfortunately you can't modulate them, but you could resample starting at different points. But you can do this. You can modulate, you can map that and automate that, so it plays back at different points in the sample, which is nice. And with pad samples, because they're quite evolving, and like they evolve over time and change quite a lot, it's kind of why this effect works quite nicely using these. So in a nutshell, if you want to kind of create these samples from scratch, you basically go through the process of finding a patch, getting the MIDI, resampling it, and then dropping it into a simpler sampler, playing around with different settings available to kind of shape the sound and adding effects. That's basically how I would do it. But if you already kind of have access to pad samples, and cheeky plug, we have a sample pack which is like purely pad samples. I can't remember how many are in it, but that's kind of what I've used for a few of these examples, and they're kind of really nice sounds. I'll just like play some if it actually loads. And you'll kind of hear what I'm talking about with the, throughout the sample you could pick different points to start at, which all would work when you add effects. Like there. So that's moving with an LFO, so it sounds a bit worse, but so if you kind of want samples similar to these ones, then it's the Ultimate Pad Collection Sample Pack. I'll link it below. just if you don't want to create them from scratch and you just want to get dropping them straight into the sampler and getting creative. So from that point onwards, that's kind of how to do it from scratch, but from that point onwards, it's kind of about trying to fit it into your groove. So basically what I would do, I would keep it to the kick, kind of how I showed last time, like keep it with hardly any elements so you can hear where you want to put these sounds. So I'm playing off this just now. So for this one, I've got it at the end of the bar, but for this one here, I wanted a filler. I'll add some effects. So it's kind of like a response, because you see the way I think, and I think it's a good way, is to basically try and fill the gaps, not have things overlapping. I'll go to this one instead. So you hear that. It's all just about like kind of trying to get the feel for it. And with this chord where I think I used this one. I used that pad, but I transposed it, and I haven't actually done much within the simpler, but the effects just change it. Bit of chorus. I've not even got the weird filter on. So you see, like, the sound source is probably just as good as using synth patches, so it's definitely a good alternative. And then this is kind of like a nice transition type stab. With LFOs and filters, which make like all the difference. And then what did I do? I think this one I kept as like a wow. That's kind of what I was talking about with the auto filter. Just take like a bandpass and whack these up quite high. And then just for one final example, because I mentioned about like when you're doing these patterns in the other video, I mentioned when you're doing these patterns, you've obviously got these individual chords bouncing off one another, which is nice. But something that can be quite cool is to basically have one or two layers that are slightly more rhythmically interesting, with a bit more going on. Obviously it depends on other elements in the groove, but you could literally try something like this, which in this case is a bit of a fill. And that's yet again the bandpass. It doesn't see, like, you can have so much fun when you're basically just jamming with these pad samples within samplers. So that's pretty much all I have to say on that front. Like, if you have any questions about stuff I might not have touched on, like the processing in particular, which, like I said, can vary, feel free to ask it below. And feel free to comment anything, like future videos you might want to see and stuff. But I hope this has kind of helped to provide a bit of an overview of, one, how to create like the samples yourselves. I've touched on it before, but I thought I'd touch on it briefly again, and then kind of how you might use pad stabs, or pads to get stabs essentially. And you get these like single note patterns, which are probably a lot easier to program in because you're not necessarily thinking about the notes, you're literally just thinking about the placement of them. So yeah, I hope that's kind of helped. If you liked it, be sure to give the video a like, subscribe, all that jazz. And if you want any of the pad samples I mentioned, then I'll link the pad below. There's some pretty good ones in there, I must say. And yeah, that's pretty much going to be it for now. I will see you in the next one.